Did you ever wonder how we got here and how tiny pieces of history have shaped our lives in ways we didn't even notice? Or realize that every day we're making history too? I'm Sarah Dowd, and this is History for Sake, the podcast that dives into the untold stories that actually matter. My mission is simple: to get as many people as I can to love history. Our history, the big stuff, the overlooked stuff, even the history we made yesterday. I want you to see history as part of our culture, our art, literature, films, performances, and realize that it's not boring, it's our muse. Each week, we'll trace big themes through everyday experiences, from actors breathing life into historical roles to authors rewriting the past for modern audiences. How film and TV reshape our view of what came before. Even our own failures? Yep, that's history too. So if you love history, culture, and everything in between, follow, subscribe, and share. Because together, we're all making history. For fuck's sake.
It's 1925, Paris. The Art Deco era is in full swing. Guerlain has just released Shalimar, inspired by the gardens of Shalimar in India, a fragrance of citrus, vanilla, and opulence that would become a global icon. It's the scent of luxury, love, and modernity. Fast forward 2 decades, though, and Europe has been torn apart by the Second World War. French perfume houses, once masters of glamour, struggled through Nazi occupation, rationing, and shortages. Some shuttered entirely. Others, like Guerlain, kept producing in small batches, holding on to beauty in the darkest of times. Post-war, the industry roared back, scents like Dior's Miss Dior becoming the symbols of rebirth. And this year, the legendary and most culturally referenced perfume, Shalimar, turns 100. In this episode, we'll be discussing how scent is more than a luxury. It's a time machine, and how nostalgia puts us in touch with our own past, the history of scent, and how it connects us to a global story. Today, I'm joined by Valerie Sadoh, founder of the House of Mahogany and co-creator, alongside myself, of the Windrush 80, To Be Educated is to Be Enraged immersive experience. This is history, for fuck's sake, at its most fragrant, nostalgic, and powerfully immersive. Valerie, welcome to History for fuck's sake. Why don't you tell us your story?
Well, I just want to say thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here, but I would love to tell you my story. Where does it start? It's always a hard place to say, but I'll say who I am and what I do. So I am Valerie Sadoh, and I am a playwright by trade and by passion. I started writing very, very early on in my life, but I won't bore you the story that my mother tells everyone about me writing from before I could even scribble on a paper. But I fell in love with storytelling kind of when my parents would have their dinner parties, and I'd kind of eavesdrop from outside the door, and I'd listen to how people would interject with their elements of their stories, and people would overlap and then agree, and then it will bring them back to another point. And I just thought it was kind of like watching a tennis match, and I was always in awe. And I thought, how do I do that? How do I capture this moment of being this little girl behind the door eavesdropping and bring that to life? And then later on in my life, I went to the theatre to the first time and watched, with my granddad, I watched Emoja, which is this West African show that was on Shaftesbury Avenue. And my heart was beating and racing. And I remember that same feeling of being that little girl behind the door and going, that's it. This is what that feeling is. Or whatever this is, I want to recreate it and be a part of it. And I realized that thing was theatre, and writing for theatre was called playwriting. And I just started writing plays with my friends and getting them up there and sending it out to whoever would read it. And then one day in 2017, one of my plays won an award called Pussy Liberty. And I thought for the first time, okay, maybe I am good at this. Maybe it does resonate with people. So I kind of started my professional writing career from 2017, writing about identity, writing about gender roles, feminism, screaming and putting things that are taboo on stage and daring the audience to have a look and a say on some of the topics that you don't see people talking about. When you do see them talking about it, it's very tiptoe around subjects. I really wanted raw, vulnerable, villain-like characters on stage and putting them in front of people for comments and suggestions and started it from there.
I think there's a lot of similarity actually when I've been sort of reading up on the history of Shalimar. It was originally produced in 1921, and then there was a sort of a bit of controversy around whether there was a pre-existing perfume of a similar name, and it was mass produced and launched in 1925, and it was aimed at the flapper market. It was aimed at young women who were finally freed from their corsets. We got a whole other episode of the podcast about corsetry, separate to this, so for our lovely listeners. And it was all about, enticing the modern woman into having a scent that sort of replaced the sort of flowery, powdery, floral scents that had been popular in the 19th century. Guerlain, as a company, started in the 1820s, from my understanding. And it's one of these sort of iconic scents that have been around for ages. And when I was doing some research on this, I couldn't believe the number of references to Shalimar in cultural sort of language, in cultural narratives. It's mentioned in films, in TV. It's mentioned in books. It's mentioned in plays. And it's mentioned going back over 100 years. I think, here's an exercise in great branding. It's a very recognizable name as well. And it was, as I mentioned earlier, it was inspired by the gardens of Shalimar. It was inspired by the wife of one of the Mughal emperors, who he built the Taj Mahal for. And so I love this idea that women's identity can be played out in so many different channels, whether it's a perfume and, a perfume that's made or a perfume that's worn, or a play where you're encouraging your audiences to participate in that and discuss taboo subjects. These are all things that perfume in the early 20th century as well. There was the whole new launch about it being much more seductive and sexualized as well. And I think it's marvelous how great creatives sort of can tell a story through multiple senses. I mean, from your perspective, you've got a connection to scent and sort of the history of scent through a business that you've started with your mother. Is that right?
Yes. So I started in lockdown, much like other people when they were making banana bread, but I'm allergic to bananas, so I had to go a different route. And I started House of Mahogany, which is a luxury home fragrance company. And it's inspired by nostalgia, scent, and storytelling. And actually, there's a more direct link to why I've founded House of Mahogany to do with my writing. And many script writers will know when you're building characters, you do like a character Bible. I would always write, what does this person look like? What did they smell like? What world are they in? And one of those ways to get into that world was smell. And I always feel like you can tell who a person is sometimes by the fragrance that they're wearing or the smell you associate with them. So that was quite a nice link for that. And whenever I'd write and then have to go back to my day job, another way I'd get myself back into writing that character again on a different day was, oh yeah, they smell like Baby Bell by Britney Spears. So I can get right back into that character again. So in lockdown, my mum and I, we were forced back into the same household, and we were thinking, oh, what do we do? We're stuck in this place and it's just monotonous. And thinking about how do you escape? What's a really quick way to escape to somewhere else? And that's usually by scent. So we'd run to TK Maxx on our 1 hour break that we were allowed in the day, and bring back as many diffusers, candles, wax melts as that we could, come back and mix and match and say, okay, if we mix this one with another one, orange with a little bit of lemon, and then with some lang lang, what does that smell like? Where does that bring us to? And we noticed between each other that certain scents were bringing us to specific moments of time that we never thought of until that moment, until we smelled that scent. It just brought us immediately back to certain places. And we thought, that's how you transform your space, which is our tagline for House of Mahogany. You can do that with just a scent. And then we started to research it, and we realized that scent actually brings you back to a specific memory or thing or time with 86% accuracy. So it was really important for us to wove that through our range in House of Mahogany. So we do scented candles, diffusers, room sprays, but they're all the range that we have are based on specific stories, moments in both my mother and I's life. I always say I have a really lovely candle that I created called Hurst Forest, and that's directly linked to the boarding school that I went to for a really short period of time called Hurst Lodge, which was in Sunningdale at the time. And there was a lovely kind of foresty woodlands in the background, and I'd always try and escape through there. So climb out of my dorm window and run through, and it just seemed to be endless. And when I made that candle, the sandalwood mixed with a little bit of the pine brought me exactly to that moment of being in that wood and trying to escape and run away. And I could just bring myself back there anytime I liked the candle. And I wanted other people to have that experience of being able to, one, go back to a certain moment of time, or create new moments of time when they get their new house, or, you know, like a new car smell. And just that moment, those are the new memories that you can make. And I think it's really powerful and important, again, of being able to not, when words fail us, what else brings us to those moments? And senses are so important for that. And, you know, being able to smell something and bring you right back to that moment, or even if you're looking forward to another moment, that's really powerful. And like you said before, time machine.
It absolutely is, and I think it's not just a time machine of your own life either. A lot of times we kind of disregard our sense of smell, and as a sense that gives us an analysis of the sort of situation that we're in. And yet there are times where it hits you like a ton of bricks, that what is this smell telling me? So, for example, where I live, there's been a lot of risk of forest fires recently. And I woke up one morning and I just could smell smoke on the air. And it immediately, I was awake, I was downstairs, I was outside in the back garden, and I was scanning the horizon, because this instinctual thing in me, it was, I smell smoke. Smoke is danger. And, so you have this really humanistic, animalistic sort of response in a time where we're kind of unused to that in, the global north, of not really responding or engaging with smell, almost like trying to eradicate smell in a lot of ways. And I think that actually, when I go to museums and I see different exhibition interpretation where they actually use smell. I was recently at the Museum of Champagne in Epernay, and they had a brilliant sort of installation where you could, big sort of almost like horns that with a squeezy that you could squeeze, for want of a better word, and the smell of the bouquet of the champagne, whether this is the smell where it's strawberries or walnuts or, the terroir of like mushrooms and things like that. And there was about 10 different sort of squeezies where you could smell. And of everything in that museum, this was the thing that was the most worn. It's only about 3-4 years old, but it was very clearly really engaging, not just for children, but for adults, because, the print was starting to wear off. You could tell that people were just all over this, squeezing the little balloon, and out comes the smell of strawberries, etc. And I always think that it's an often overlooked sort of area of how we can connect with our personal past, where we can connect with more sort of global or community histories as well. And what have you found since you started the House of Mahogany, and sort of what have other people sort of expressed to you about it?
Yeah, I think more to your point about it's a lost art, maybe using the sense of your smell. It's because we've become so cerebral these days, and everything is so maybe logical and brain heavy that we forget that some of the easiest ways to get the message across is by scent. Like if we all walked into a room and we smelt fire, we'd all know danger is approaches. We wouldn't have to go one by one and tell each other, fire is among us. And I think that's the thing that people like the most. It's so instant. In this really fast day and age, we are really missing like that understanding of how do we get this interpretation of this building across to everyone really quickly? Well, smell. If you walk into a place and it smells heavy and damp, there's a connotation with that immediately. Or when you walk into a place and it smells, airy and light and fresh, it has another connotation. So I think whenever I do markets for House of Mahogany, people come up and they don't really know what they're looking for. I ask them, what kind of scents are you normally into? And they can't quite articulate what they're looking for. And sometimes they'll tell me a feeling, like my grandmother's house or something like that. And then I see them maybe 2 minutes later smelling a candle, and then they pick up a candle and they go, that is it. Whatever this is, that is it. And it's just no way to kind of share that other than just to smell it. And then whoever they're with, they also share that with their friend, and their friend exactly knows kind of what that person was trying to articulate in the beginning, but couldn't quite understand. And that's another asset of scent that I think is really beautiful, is it can take you back to a time where you didn't exist in, or that you are otherwise unfamiliar with. I now am brought into that space with you because you have shared this particular scent with me. Because you can tell me all about your grandmother's house all day long, and I can tell you what it looks like. But if you can show me what this candle smells like, my grandmother's house, I then go, oh, she was sweet, she was gentle, she was loving, she was warm. And it can just happen in that immediate second. And I think that's something that I really love about, I know we're going to talk about it later, but immersive experiences, because when I learn about other people's stories, I want to know what it feels like to have been them at that time. I want to know what they were hearing. I want to know what kind of the pace of life. And you get that with smell just in that moment.
For me, personally, I lost my uncle, who was 90 last year, and he and I have been very, very close. And he was a cigar smoker. And he liked Courvoisier brandy as well. So every time, so I have books that came from the house, and every time I sort of pick up that book, I can smell the cigar smoke on it. And I'm immediately right back to sort of chatting with him, not just, of recent times, but going back to my childhood as well. And I just think it's something that we ought to embrace more, is that sort of that sense of smell, that the different senses that we've got to be able to tell a story, to release anxiety. We're so visually and auditorially stimulated these days, through digital, through like just general life and everything that we see, that to have these connections to smell, to taste, being very, very connected to sense of smell as well, to food, and sort of how that sort of can be rolled in together to tell these amazing stories. And one of those amazing stories that I was thinking about was the project that you and I are working on, which is all about the 80th anniversary of the Empire Windrush coming to London. And I thought that we could talk a little bit about how you have conceptualized telling that story in a multisensory, immersive way. So, Valerie, you've got Windrush. It's a story that some people, but not enough people, know about. It is going to be the 80th anniversary in 2028, but it is deeply connected to the role of people from around the British Empire and the Commonwealth in the Second World War, which is why we're talking about it now. Tell me about that experience, that story, and how you envisage telling that story to a wider range of people.
Absolutely. I think when first hearing about Windrush 80, I was really excited anyway, because I love I love experiencing that moment of time. And also I love all the history around the Afro-Caribbean community. But the more I started to research things, and I've heard about Windrush my whole life, but the more I started to research things specifically for this project, I kept saying, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that. And the more I said I didn't know that, I got a little bit more angry at the fact that there's so many people that know Windrush, but yet we don't know any of the real details. We don't know how it's impacted and infiltrated into our society today. And I think that is why, one, there's so many misconceptions on Windrush. And two, it's because that's why we don't really honor it correctly, because we're not really educated on it. So that's why the phrase "to be educated is to be enraged" came out, because it's the truth. I was angry that I didn't know the truth of this story, and I was angry that I didn't know that we weren't sharing it and we weren't telling and honoring the past correctly. And I think that is what I envision for Windrush 80, is a authentic and correct honoring of time, of that period of time, less about trying to change conceptions of that group of people, but more trying to authentically relive a period of time and bring that time to life, so that people can take the correct information and do with that what they please, and they can unlearn some things that they may have learned along the lines, or experience something for the first time that they haven't experienced. And one of the ways I thought of that, because when you said immersive, we normally think about visual things, but one of the key things about, especially when you're an immigrant in this country, you can go to certain places and you smell something and you go, oh my gosh, that's what it's like to be back home. I haven't thought about that in a long time. And that taste or smell has just taken me right there. And I thought, I can't wait to have that moment with Windrush 80, when people walk through the doors or through the facility or however we do it, and they go, oh, this was the moment that, Windrush, like the community came to England. This is the smell of of their surroundings. This is smell of the water, like different things like that, that would bring you to that moment. And less about kind of presenting a story and more about feeling and being part of the journey was really important to me. And then also learning things about, how people first came to England. We normally think it's, people trying to get away from the horrors of their native country, when really it was about the Commonwealth being called upon to support the economy and the infrastructure of the country post World War II. And these people from the Commonwealth doing us a favor. And I know we don't like to speak about English history like that, but we needed help. Well, the UK needed help, and they were delighted to step up. But it wasn't just let's come to England because the streets are paved with gold that we normally get told, but because they were active members of the Commonwealth and they were proud to be part of the Commonwealth, and they were happy to give their time, efforts, talents, and education towards the systems that are still in place today.
If only the welcome that they had was reciprocated in the way. It's horrific when you hear about the personal stories and experiences of struggling to find accommodation, struggling to make friends, develop relationships as a result of that, and that real prejudice that is part of British history, and it still is part of British current society, although many people are working very hard to try and counter that as best they can. I'm Canadian. I'm a Commonwealther as well, and I look at what Canada was doing in the Second World War. We stormed the beaches at D-Day at Juno alongside our British, Free French, the Americans. We built Lancasters, not just outside of Toronto. We had actually international spy containment camps in Canada as part of it. But you're absolutely right. It was a call up to, in order for Britain to rebuild itself after the war, it needed the help of the Commonwealth, of the countries and the people of those countries that were part of that were many of whom were seeking independence at that time as well. And I think that there is something so poignant about being able to tell that story in an environment where we're not just seeing people on screen or on a 2D picture, but where we're going to be able to experience them in an immersive way, live action actors, digital recreations where appropriate, and to be able to sort of almost step into the shoes of those people's stories, and not just it be a conglomeration of people, of those amazing people who answered the call and came over on the Windrush, the individual stories behind each of those. And I was very lucky. I worked at the Imperial War Museum in the sort of early 2000s, and I was a big part of the leadership team who organized the 60th anniversary commemoration events as part of the Their Past Your Future program. And I was, privileged to be able to tell different stories of people from around the Commonwealth, from around the British Empire, who contributed to the Allies movement, both in a military function, in a civilian function, and how, the world came together to combat xenophobia and the Holocaust and put ourselves forward to do something right as a global community. And that seems to be getting farther and farther away these days in current circumstances. But I really responded to, when we were discussing how Windrush 80 was going to come together, to this idea of a walking experience that incorporated the music, incorporated, you being able to interact with somebody who was embodying that story, that in their own right, just by being with an actor or a live action interpreter of that story, you're getting a three-dimensional sensory experience right away, aren't you?
Exactly. And I love that you said 3D because I think we talk about history a lot, quite in two-dimensional. And we see certain events very separate. We see Windrush separate to Falkland Wars, separate to, Biafra Wars in Africa. And we know from living now that much of these things don't happen on its own. They're normally on top of each other, one after another. And the world is not just doing one event at a time. And I think that was really important about this story being 3D. What was it like to be in that time while Windrush was happening? What else in the world was happening that played a role on, the feeling of what it was like to come here, or the welcome that they didn't get. What was life like when they were coming from Trinidad and Tobago? What was going on in that side of the world? I wanted it to be a full conversation instead of just this flashlight on a specific time. So having the macro, which is the Windrush, and then the micro of people's stories, because people's personal histories are so important to where they are now. And, if you were a young girl or boy coming from Trinidad and Tobago or coming from Jamaica, and you have never seen a country full of white people, what was that like? And vice versa for the schools that you were going to, like you had never seen this community of kids before, and what was it like to adjust and understand each other? And what was it like coming from a country that was sunny and the climate was really warm to now it's rainy and it's dark, and what impact that had, but also what impact of leaving generations of family behind. What was it like to come on your own and want to promise that you'd come back and get your kids and spouse, and what did that feel like, and how did that impact your journey throughout your time here? And that's the way we get real 3D stories, when we're able to not just interrogate the highlights, but also the everyday person who was part of that movement and moment. That's how you get the full kind of picture. That was important.
I mean, history, for me, it's just a series of billions of intersecting stories and experiences. And I think what I'm particularly excited about with Windrush 80 and the work that we're trying to do in advance of the anniversary is also about that it's not just one story in black and white. It is a multi-layered, complex experience of a human life, from the outright prejudice, racism, go home, being spat on, to actually hearing the music that, walking down a street and being and actually overhearing music that might be reminiscent of Trinidad, and recognizing that there are other people here, and then that sort of that connecting to that, particularly in the Tilbury Docks area. One of the best, by the way, cultural series to watch if you want to know what that area looked like, felt like when Windrush arrived, is called The Midwife, actually.
Yeah.
And particularly the early episodes, which are set in 1958, I think. But that teeming sort of human experience of what was the London Docklands. And the London Docklands Museum, by the way, is excellent as well. And that's what excites me about this is I want people to be able to have an experience where it's not just about, this is the story, this is how people felt, this is how people were treated, but actually almost walk in their shoes more as a way of going, okay, and this is how, people made themselves feel more at home, how they developed a sense of community here in Britain. But also fast forward this 70 years to the absolute atrocious experience in the mid-teens in the last decade or so, where people who came on the Windrush and at the time of that, we're being looked at being forced to return to the Caribbean because of documentation anomalies and the complete sort of, what are you talking about? How can our system still 70 years later have such massive gaping holes in it that continues to prejudice against people who came here to help rebuild Britain after the war?
And it's indicative of almost what the feeling was at the time, that a clerical error could erase somebody's history, because at the time it wasn't important enough to do the right documentation and embed these people into the UK society, not just by making them neighbours and giving them houses, but putting them into the system and ensuring that they had the right documentation to take full advantage of their citizenship. That in itself is almost the proof of systemic racism. And another thing as well is being able to walk through this immersive experience and having almost grown up with that generation of people and taken a part in the rituals or the cultural practices, and then ending on something like this whole thing just didn't exist. And what impact would that have on you as an audience goer if you were able to go through this whole process and then somebody didn't acknowledge that you were even there? Like, I don't know how we would do that, but it's almost powerful in itself to have this enlightening experience and then immediately get it taken from you.
It's something I find deeply horrifying about, and it's not just British culture, it is Western culture, this total fairy tale that they believe that Western culture, British culture, is a white culture. It is not a white culture. We are an island, and from the very first people who populated this island across the land bridge, across Doggerland into continental Europe, they've come from Central Europe. The original Celts come from that. They come from the Iberian Peninsula. We are all incomers. And it down to, it boggles my Anglo-Saxons. This is the name. They're from Denmark, okay? And the multicultural history of Britain, of the UK, is vast. And it's something that I've always had a profound interest in, working on a variety of heritage projects over the last 15, 20 years, from Alexandra Palace, where I had an amazing experience working with the U3A group in Haringey. And we talked about the memories of the people in that group of listening to the BBC being broadcast across the Caribbean, and then in the sort of the 1950s, their experience of that, and going to their neighbor's house to listen to the boxing coming on, the sports, to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth the second in the 50s, and being able to just sort of immerse myself in just the storytelling and the memories of these different communities. I worked at the now newly opened Norwich Castle project, where, Norwich itself, as part of the Hanseatic League, the connections that Britain and its port cities had through the age of sail, steam, to other parts of the world. It is an incredibly multicultural experience. And I hate that it's literally whitewashed out of our history by so many people, because it's not the truth. It is not the truth at all. And yeah, I'm proud to be playing a role, no matter how small, in trying to combat that misinformation.
I think that's why timeline is really important and what was happening in the world surrounding this moment, because people don't seem to put two and two together. That wasn't the first time that anyone from an African Caribbean country had come to the UK, and we start to think that that was the genesis of our history, when really it's just a moment in time. And there was so much before that, and there will be so much after that. And I think when we have a better understanding of our past, we'll have a better understanding of how to move forward. And I think that's really what we want out of this Windrush 80. Is yes, we're honoring this time so that we can have changed behavior towards the future.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit about, what do you hope for how museums, heritage, theater, immersive arts, how do you think that they can connect more with people and with stories that haven't been surfaced and told in the same way as, say our traditional stories have been told? What do you think that, they can take and start to develop more with, as part of this sort of re-engaging the senses and re-engaging new audiences with history through different senses?
I think, the greatest stories of history just they haven't been told yet. And I think that's something that needs to be at the heart of any museum or art gallery or historic building these days, because we have told some great stories. We've almost overtold them. It's time to actively be searching for stories that haven't been told yet, from perspectives we haven't heard from, different elements of the world. We are so global now that it's very hard to say we'll just tell a story from this side of the world, because people are constantly moving around and we're going to more countries than we've ever really been in history before. So therefore we need to tell global stories from global perspectives, from global truths, and be as almost as objective as we can. We tell stories very heavily from the victor's side. But what is it like? What was life like when you hadn't won the war? What was life like when you had to go back and rebuild your country? Like VJ Day was a really poignant moment for me, because we celebrate it. But what were they doing in Japan at that time, and how did they rebuild the country after that? Kind of stuff. So I think that's what we need to do, with capture stories that haven't been told, and then also do it in a way that is forward thinking, and a way that is a break from what we're always seeing in daily life. We're on our phone and we're getting videos, and that stuff is great. But imagine being able to walk onto, a battlefield and have the conversation with someone else in the trenches, or, go to a moment in time when you were rebuilding your country, and working in the factories, or weaving, materials together. What was that like? And having those moments of cultural practice and being involved with that, and physically putting your hands to those actions that we probably haven't done before. Those are really good ways of connection. But we have to be actively seeking out those stories. We don't know what we don't know.
And thinking about how we tell those stories in a way, it's like, I one of the things I think about is, I'd love to do an experience in the dark where we tell, stories from history, but we can only tell them through a non-visual way. And so people have to let the rest of their senses, actually take over, and see what our sort of more animalistic, more instinctual responses are to those stories when we can't see them. So who knows? Maybe that can be another work for Les Raconteurs.
I really enjoyed. I think I saw it in a festival years ago, at the Vault Festival, where you went into this dark room and it was just sound. And I think sound as well is another element that's quite great, and to just bring you back to what it sounded like to be there in that moment, and your body kind of does the rest, because you'll then learn, your heart was beating, or that person's heart may have been beating at that time, because it will take you right back there as well. And that's the way to do that.
I went on a terrifying experience at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival a couple of years back, where it was a sort of shipping container, and it was all sort of laid out sort of like bunk beds, and you got given a bunk bed and you got given headphones, and then you were given 2 pills, and then they close the doors and you're lying in these bunk beds with these, headphones on, and being told, you can choose to take the pill or you can not choose to take the pill. But it was absolutely pitch black, and I'm a bit claustrophobic anyway. So I was in this bunk, and that was the thing that was really getting to me in the dark, was feeling like I was in this tiny little box. And I mean, I just had to sort of center myself and go, it's just an art exhibition. It's just an art exhibition, because, I was about to freak out. I think that we should do more experimentation around this kind of stuff to tie ourselves into thinking and experiencing something in a not necessarily an intellectual or immediately an intellectual perspective.
Yeah, and I think that is what art is as well. We forget something, that art can be enjoyable, but also it can be experiential, it can be experimental. And then also we have to allow it to not be everybody's cup of tea as well. And that's where we can push the boundaries and really, go for it, because there might be an audience out there that really do love connecting in that way. And you don't want to lose those people as well.
Valerie, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed today. And thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Loved it.
Thanks for listening to History for F***'s Sake. I'm so grateful you joined me to explore some of the untold stories that have shaped people's lives and experiences. If you've got a question, a story, or an idea, let me know. Rate, review, and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And visit us at historyffs.com or History FFS Pod on socials to connect. Together, we're all making history for F***'s sake.